Thanks, Mary. I'm Becky Reback. I am the head of parent and family coaching at Evolved Education. I am a certified collaborative and proactive solutions, otherwise known as CPS provider. And I'm really excited to be here and to share with all of you about this model and hopefully give you some tips to take away. And hopefully this changes, like I said, your mindset of how you parent. That's really my goals for tonight, is for you to take away some tips and to have a different mindset, or at least try to have a different mindset. It's like we said, we have to be kind to ourselves. So if we put our best foot forward, that's what matters the most. Mary, I'm gonna let you do this.
So I'll just take this quick slide. So welcome everyone. My name is Mary Mealy. I'm the founder of Evolved Education Company, and I just wanted to introduce everyone to our company in case you're coming here for the first time. So we are a company that serves families. We offer 3 services. One is one-to-one tutoring. The next is parent education consulting, which is what Becky Reback is basically involved in right now. And the last is school placement advisement. So you can find us at www.evolveded.com. And if you're interested in any services or Becky's coaching after this wonderful webinar that you're going to learn so much from, you can email us at the admin@evolveded email, and we'll be happy to set that up for you.
Okay, so we're just going to jump right in. So I'm going to present 2 scenarios, and I think it's one situation, but different scenarios and how this situation might play out. And I think most people will relate to this. If not this exact scenario, then something similar has definitely happened in your family with at least one of your children. So imagine it is dinner time, and you call Jamie, your child, in for dinner, and Jamie, it's dinner. And then there's 2 ways that this could possibly go. The first is plan A. And the reason this is called plan A is because this is how most people's initial response and process would go. So keep in mind that plan A is unilateral and it's uninformed. So dinner happens at 6 p.m. every single night. Your child knows that. The expectation is very clear. Dinner's at 6. You call them in, they don't come. Every night it's the same thing. Okay, you're getting more and more frustrated. Everyone else is coming to dinner. Their 2 younger siblings managed to get there and sit and wait for Jamie to come. And you're just really frustrated and annoyed. So you start off with something like, I've decided that I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning and then a 1-minute warning so you know what time dinner is. Okay, so this is your adult imposed consequence. You make the decision, you have no information from your kid, you just decide that they just need a warning and then they'll be able to come. Maybe that works for a couple of days and then it goes back to Jamie's not coming to dinner. Then you say, okay, I know Jamie really just needs the motivation to come to dinner. So you implement a reward. And if you your reward is if you come to dinner when I call you, you'll have 5 extra minutes of TV time before bed. And Jamie's like, oh, this is amazing. I love TV time. And then it works for a week and you think you're a superstar and all's right. And then a week later, guess who's not coming to dinner? And the cycle continues and goes on and on and on. Jamie has not had a voice in this situation because even though a reward is meant to be positive, right, you implemented it without getting information from him. Now we're going to flip to plan B. This is the way we want caregivers and families to move towards. We want people to start edging themselves towards this collaborative and informed model. Okay, so plan B, in a plan B conversation, you're proactively out of the moment having a calm conversation with Jamie. You're using specific research-based language that the CPS model is based off of to open the conversation. The language sounds something like this. Hey, Jamie, I've noticed you're having difficulty ending basketball and coming inside for dinner. What's up? Right? So you're not naming the behavior. You're not blaming Jamie. You're noticing. It's been really hard to come inside for dinner. Jamie has an opportunity to share his perspective, his point of view, right? Your child is now feeling heard and maybe for the first time ever. So this might feel really weird for your kid to feel heard. There are specific strategies that you can use to ask Jamie questions about what's going on for him when it comes time to go to dinner. One of them is knowing the situational factors, and you say, hey, like grandpa watches you every Thursday and you come in right when grandpa calls you for dinner, but not when I call you for dinner. What's up? What's the difference, right? Jamie shares, well, with grandpa, we eat dinner at 6 and I'm not hungry at 6 o'clock, right? So now you're starting to get a little bit of Jamie's perspective. You're understanding what's going on for him or her in that moment. Now you as the caregiver, you get to share your concern too, right? The thing is, you're missing out on that family time, and we're all there to share with and enjoy dinner together and talk about our day before we move on to other activities before dinner. Jamie has an opportunity to learn some empathy because he's listening to your point of view. And then together you and Jamie arrive at a solution that not only works for him, but also works for you, right? Those solutions are realistic, they're mutually satisfactory. You guys can actually both uphold your end of the bargain. Together you've decided, no problem, we can push dinner to 6:30. Next day, all the days after, 6:30 rolls around, Jamie comes running to dinner. Now, obviously it's not always that cut and dry, right? It's not always that simple and quick. There are times that we have to revisit a plan B conversation and a solution. But the point is, Jamie has had an opportunity to be involved in the conversation and share what is coming up for him or her in that moment. And usually it's something you never would have imagined. Most of the time, caregivers come to these conversations with preconceived notions, and 9 times out of 10, those notions are blown out of the water. And the kid really surprises them with something, a totally different concern that you never would have considered. So I want to take a minute, and Mary, I'm actually going to hand this one over to you. I want to take a minute and think about establishing our why. And this is really important because knowing why you want to adopt this mindset is going to help you kind of lead with this and understand where you want your kid to go. And this is a practice that we do when we're coaching together. And we really think about the skills and the type of person we want our kids to have. So Mary actually, like she said, went through this coaching with me. And we did a bunch of Plan Bs with her children. And so Mary, I'd love for you to share your experience going through this part of the process and how it kind of what your goals were for your kids and how that all was incorporated here.
Sure, great. So, I mean, I have 3 children ranging from 7 years old until 13 years old. And I will say that before this training, which actually happened during COVID, I definitely did many Plan A's. I was the queen of the star chart and the outside rewards, and also many assumptions as to why my children were doing what they were doing. So, and I do go there right now, even knowing all of this. So just to put that out there, very human.
I mean, I go there too, and I'm trained in it. So.
Yeah. So, but I will say I've learned, I've really shifted my mindset through this training. And, you know, one of my whys, and I talked to Becky about this, and, you know, my husband is co-parenting, so we are really, you know, thinking this way together, is just when I think about my kids as adults, let's say, you know, they're out of the house and they're out in the world doing whatever they're doing, I would love to be in their life, and I would love for them to call me if they're having some kind of day, whether it be a great day or not a great day, and just share information with me, and, you know, certainly come to me with what's happening for them. And then I can always feel free to offer a suggestion or not, you know, but I definitely want to have that exchange. And I feel like if there are so many Plan A's going on, and I think we can all think of the other relationships in our lives where we have a lot of those Plan A relationships. It just doesn't feel like you really want to reach out to that person all that much because you don't feel heard. And I really wanted that as my why, right? So, you know, we were having some issues, and I have 2 children that have special needs. And it was a challenge because I felt like I was asking reasonable things of them. And everyone had a bit of a different thing going on. And I was getting frustrated. We were getting nowhere. We were getting into arguments and everyone was getting frustrated. And when we worked with Becky and we learned this model, it really taught both of us, like my husband and I were on the same page, and then we got, my older son first involved. And it was funny. I mean, it was a little bit awkward to like start just by engaging with him really differently than he's been used to. So that was a little vulnerable for all of us. But Becky sat there with us and just kind of said, let's give it some time. And, in the questioning that she's talking about, the first thing that you do is you do say, I've noticed that you're having difficulty with, and for us, the problem that she kind of played out there was one of our problems was coming to dinner, and the kids would be doing what they were doing and my one son was not coming to dinner. We were calling and calling and calling and calling. It was just a source of daily frustration, and albeit maybe minimal, it was something we felt like we could tackle with this model first. So we did, and we sat there and asked him, like, we noticed that you're having trouble coming up for dinner. What's up? And there was no talking, right? Remember that? Like, no talk for a real, I felt like it was such a long time, and I wanted to jump in and give him words and say what I thought was happening. But I'm so glad I didn't, because I just sat there and I kind of looked at my husband. We just, in awkward silence, it felt like forever. Was it forever? I don't know.
It was not forever.
It felt like forever. Yeah.
Yes, it felt like a long time. Yeah. Even knowing your son pretty well, it definitely felt like a while. But you hung in there.
I did. So I didn't say anything, and then I went through. They teach you the language of probing questions. So that's been immensely helpful for me, because it's a way to extract, especially having a child with language-based learning disabilities. It helps them to extract some ideas and really to probe and continue to ask questions. And what was also challenging for me was actually being in that step for a long time. And you really do need to be in that step for a while so that you can really understand all of what's happening for your child. And I so appreciated that coaching, because I was able to understand my child in a way I never have before. And I consider myself a pretty in-tune parent. And it was pretty shocking to me, actually. I was like kind of floored that this was happening. And I was kind of like, whoa, I'm learning so much about this person that I'm, I get to be his mom, and I had no idea. Right. And then, when he came out finally at the end of the day about this issue, like, to him, he wasn't hungry when we were having dinner. So we just moved the time. That was our mutually acceptable and reasonable solution. And guess what? It worked. And honestly, part of it was like, maybe that wasn't really the reason that he wasn't coming up. Cause of course I was thinking like, he's just doesn't want to hang out with us. He's like trying to do what he wants to do. He's being fresh. Like, I don't know. I was thinking of all these other things. Who cares? He defined it for himself, and he owned it, and he felt like we came up with this together. And quite frankly, there hasn't been an issue going forward. So, for me, it was a really interesting process. And as soon as it sort of like happened to me, I just knew we had to bring this into the work that we do with parents here at Evolved, because we're all about learning. And yes, we tutor kids, and yes, we tutor for, getting into schools, but we're doing this parent education piece because we think that if your kid's going to learn well, you as a parent really need to learn well too. So I'm so excited to get into all of this, but that's kind of like, the story of how come this came to be. So totally transformed a lot for me. Yeah.
Something you said was really important, right? That your son had the space, right? He was allowed that space to share, right? And I think one thing that all parents want for their kids is for them to be able to solve problems, right? And yes, like, you need to be able to ask for help when you need it and go to people for advice. Like you said, like, you want your kids to call you when they're older, but you need your children to grow up and learn how to manage problems and how to approach challenging situations. And this is exactly what this is. These are challenging situations that are happening day to day. And our goal for our kids is to, when they're in their office at work, when they're 25 and they're having an issue with their boss, like, you want them to be able to go to their boss and say, hey, this is what's coming up for me. What's coming up for you? Can we work on this? I'm not sure what you're asking of me, right? Like, This is all in efforts to think about when your kid is there, that adult, and they're out in the world, what kind of human do you want them to be? Do you want them to be the ones that come to you and say, what should I do? Tell me exactly what I should do. Or do you want them to come to you and say, hey, what's your thoughts? Can I have your advice? Here's what I'm thinking. Can you help me figure this out, right? Like there's a difference between those type of people. And I would imagine people already, you know, in this talk already see their kids as one way or another, right? I think, you know, especially kids that are growing up during this strange time, what a gift that we can give them is to be able to collaboratively communicate with the people in their lives, especially as you're sitting at home in your living room. That's also your office, that's also your school, that's also your dining room, whatever it is. You know, being able to communicate your needs to other people and have them actually really listen to them and acknowledge them is a powerful thing for our kids.
Yeah, that's so great. I love that you just taught me something there too, which I would love to think was always in me, but it's accurate that we do want them to have these skills of problem solving. And yeah, so thank you for punctuating that. So great.
So what is collaborative and proactive solutions, right? Like the shorthand is CPS, and I'm always, it's funny, I always like to first say collaborative and proactive solutions because CPS is also Child Protective Services. So I'm always a little bit wary to just say CPS, but what is collaborative and proactive solutions? This model is non-adversarial, non-punitive. It's a different way that we can communicate and approach our children in challenging situations. It's a partnership. First and foremost, it's a proactive partnership between adults and children. Dr. Green, who founded the model, likes to say that this process teaches the kids skills that are on the better side of humanity. So all those things that we hope for our kids, this is what this is getting at. It teaches empathy. It teaches appreciating how one's behavior is affecting others. It teaches how to resolve disagreements without conflict. It teaches perspective taking, honesty. I said empathy, right? Like that's a huge one. The model is based on the premise that challenging behavior happens when the expectations that are placed on your child exceed your child's capacity to respond adaptively. So many people going through this say, but it's a plan A world. That's the world we live in. And most people can function in the plan A world and respond adaptively to all the plan A's that are happening, right? Like actually responding to a plan A takes a lot of skills, and kids that are struggling just don't have those skills. It doesn't mean they can't get them. It doesn't mean we can't move them there, but they just don't have them right now. And some kids are just, they're lacking the skills to handle the demands and expectations that are placed on them. So CPS is designed to be proactive. And we're going to talk about a tool called the Assessment of Lagging Skills and Unsolved Problems. And that's really the tool you need to be proactive, where you're listing your unsolved problems, you're recognizing patterns and seeing that these challenging episodes that you're having are highly predictable, right? So you came into our coaching sessions with a few ideas. And I know you had a little bit of background on the model, but we did a much deeper dive into it. So you had a few ideas, but if I remember correctly, like when we sat and did the ALSUP with you and your husband, there were a lot of patterns that came out, right? And everything was sort of surrounding transitions.
Yeah.
And there were a bunch of things when we did your older son, that you were like, wow, like this is really obvious. Like this is the area that he's really, really struggling in. And you're like, and I kind of knew, but now it's really obvious. And now I know I can proactively talk about these, so I don't have to struggle with all these transitions moving forward. Right. Yeah. So that's really the goal of the ALSUP, which we're gonna talk about. Okay. So challenge, and this is where it's going to be a little interactive, and people can keep these private, or if they want to share in the chat, we would love to hear from you. But challenging behavior, this is important. Challenging behavior is the signal that something is wrong. It is your fever, right? So when you get the flu and you get like your first sign that something's wrong is you have a fever. So that's what challenging behavior is. It's your signal, it's your fever, okay? So I want people right now on a Post-it, on their iPad, note-taking thing, whatever you're writing, have a writing utensil near you, it could be digital or not, take a minute and write down your child's signals or their challenging behavior. And if you're feeling really brave, we'd love for you to share. This is your child's way of communicating what's wrong. And I like to highlight this lucky and unlucky because, again, remember that this is all in the efforts for shifting our mindsets. So there are two types of kids you could have. You could have lucky kids and you can have unlucky kids. Lucky kids are the ones whose challenging behavior enacts sympathy from other people. Crying, pouting, using their words to say, I'm not happy, right? And then unlucky kids are the ones that you have these really extreme behaviors and people are like, oh my God, I'm scared of it, or I'm just gonna yell back at them, right? Like screaming. How many times have this kid screamed at you and you screamed back? Hitting, running, biting, punching, right? All those really undesired behaviors. And something to my favorite quote from Dr. Reen, and Mary, I know you've heard me say this like 9 million times, is good parenting and good teaching, if there's any educators on here, are being responsive to the hand you've been dealt. So you can have a lucky kid and it's pretty easy to deal with that hand, or you could have a really unlucky kid and it's really difficult to deal with that hand. And the goal of CPS is, whether your kids have lucky signals or unlucky signals, is to help you manage how you're going to approach those situations. So have we gotten any, has anyone been brave in the chat?
Not particularly, but I will say that I've had a kid that's been lucky and unlucky at the same time in different stages of life. And I remember, like in the playground when they were kids and there was a biting stage and a hitting stage, and you feel so awful as a parent when those things are happening. And I guess it's just something to have some empathy around too. I just feel like it's really hard, really tough. So we do have a quick question, and I sort of think I know the answer to this, but quick follow-up. What if the other parent says, we have 3 kids, to the whole situation from before about the solution that we came up with about moving the dinner time. So we have 3 kids. We aren't going to move the family dinner time for only one of them. Is the thought that you allow, by way of example, the child to have his dinner at 6:30 and the other dinner at 6?
So this is actually one of my favorite questions, and I'm sure you do know the answer to it. So if that works for you, right? So when you're evaluating solutions, it has to be realistic and mutually satisfactory. So if you're okay with your kid eating on their own at 6:30, okay, that's great. If you're really, really okay with it and it's actually realistic for you, okay? But if it's not, then, and we're gonna, especially if anyone goes through the coaching, we talk a lot about evaluating solutions. But if a kid proposes a solution like changing the dinner time and it's not realistic for you, you can say that, right? Because you have a say in this situation too. It's not all about your kid. Yes, you want to hear what your kid has to say. Yes, you want to give them the first crack at coming up with a solution. Yes, this is meant for their participation and for their point of view to be heard. However, like I said, the solutions have to be realistic and mutually satisfactory. So that mutually satisfactory is really key. So you can say something like, wow, thank you so much for coming up with a solution. It's really hard to think of solutions. Let's see if that's really gonna work, right? And then you're gonna ask questions that kind of evaluates whether that's gonna work or not, right? Or you could straight up say like, thank you so much. I just don't think that's gonna work because, like I said, my concern was that like it's a family time, right? So then maybe your kid says, okay, well, I'll sit at dinner so I can chat with everybody, but I'm not gonna eat until 6:30. And then maybe you're like, okay, like that's a really great solution, right? Because it satisfies both concerns. So no, you don't have to just change and the solution, the whole dinner time for one family or for one family member. And if eating at 6:30 works for you, then that's fine too.
That was something that, so can you, and we might be going a little out of order, but maybe it's good to give everyone a framework, because to me this makes sense, because there's really there's three parts to the discussion.
Yeah. So we're going to get into the three parts to the discussion. I can briefly say it, and then we could just keep moving along so we could get to it.
Yeah.
But in the Plan B discussion, the three parts are the empathy step, where you pose your unsolved problem and hear from your child. That's where you're using the drilling strategies that Mary talked about. Then there's the define adult concern step, where you get to lay your concerns on the table and make sure your child actually is listening to and understands your concerns. And then the third is the solution. And so if the solution comes after you've had this really pretty in-depth conversation to understand what both parties' concerns are. And you're recapping both concerns, and you're seeing if there's a way that we could find a way to meet both concerns. That's in fact language that we use in the solution step. So, and the solution is always evaluated. You don't just pick the first solution that your kid, like sometimes people are so excited that the kid has actually suggested something and it's like somewhat reasonable. They're like, great, let's do it, because they don't want to upset the kid, right? But the whole point of this is that you're both in this together. So you need to be able to have that conversation and that back and forth. And because you're doing it in a really non-combative way, I mean, I've done this in schools. I've been in special ed for 10 years, and the most recent school I was at fully adopted this model. And so I coached teachers on how to use this, and they were always worried about that. Like, I'm going to upset the kid after all this great conversation. And the kid was like, oh yeah, okay. Almost every time the kid was like, I see how that isn't realistic for you. So yeah, okay, let's reevaluate this and let's find a different way. Or they kind of talk about a workaround. And the kids are just so happy that they're finally being listened to, that I think they're excited to communicate with you and hear from you also. I hope that answered the question. I'm going to keep moving.
Feel free to keep the questions coming.
Yes.
If you feel like you have any. Great.
Okay. This is one of my favorite images. So any talk we ever do in any coaching session, I will always show this image. So this is the clash of two forces. Challenging behavior, or what Dr. Green affectionately calls incompatibility episodes, happen when the expectation outstrips the skill. So the lagging skills are what your kid brings to the table, and the expectation are what the adults bring to the table. I want to take a minute and talk about expectations. And Mary, I want to hear from you too a little bit about the expectations you had. So what is an expectation? An expectation is a belief that something will happen or is likely to happen. So as parents, we have certain expectations for our children. We expect them to get out of bed when we wake them up. We expect them to brush their own teeth, depending on their age, right? Like, we expect them to get dressed independently before school, again, depending on their age. We expect they'll complete their homework independently, or at least sitting at the table next to me while I'm doing my work, right? We have so many expectations in our day-to-day for our children, for our partners, for our colleagues, for ourselves. Mary and I were talking about that in our little pregame talk, right? The list goes on. There's just, like, for our, taxi driver, for our doorman, whatever. So the CPS model is based on the idea that we communicate our expectations to our children clearly and effectively, okay? So it could be children or students if you're an educator. So the model is also based on the idea that the expectation, and this is really key, and I know we talked about this a lot, so I would love to hear from you too, is that the expectation is realistic for that child, right? So if you have 3 kids, you can have an overarching expectation, but you might need to modify it based on your kid. So remember, that favorite quote of mine is that we have to be responsive to the hand we've been dealt. So if you have 3 kids, you have 3 different humans in your house. So you have to deal with each kid and meet them where they're at. That's really, really important. So I want everyone another moment, and if you're feeling brave, please share. Take a minute and write down your top 5 expectations for your children. I don't mean like getting married and going to college, right? Like we all have those general expectations. I mean your day-to-day expectations, like sitting at the table with the family for dinner or turning the lights off in your bedroom by 9 p.m. Please share those if you'd like. And then as you're writing them down, I want the caregivers to think about how many of these expectations, my daily expectations, is my child struggling with? Where is the clash of the two forces? If they're struggling, is your expectation realistic, right? Like a lot of this coaching that I'm going to do is really talking through your expectations and if they're realistic, if they're consistent. This is really, really important. Like if sometimes you're okay with the lights, other times it has to be a hard 9 o'clock, that's really confusing for kids. Kids like really, really clear direction. And so I'm always advising families to approach each difficulty that they're having with their child and really evaluate their expectations and make sure that it's clear, that it's realistic, that you've actually had a conversation about it and it's not just an implied expectation. And just, having that kind of family meeting, setting the expectations and seeing if that resolves the incompatibility episode you're having. And if it doesn't, then we know we need to move forward with a plan. So can you share when we did some of this work, how like your expectation shift or what some of your expectations were and how kind of this helped you revamp them?
Yeah, sure. So do you remember we were having an issue? The boys share a room and they were not getting to bed and they were so tired. And the reason they weren't getting to bed is because they have different bedtimes, and the younger one would go to bed. He'd wait up for the older one. The older one would get in and talk like along the way. And then they would stay up another hour and then everyone was super tired. So it was important to us that they get sleep, and we were stressed about it. So our expectation was that they had a bedtime, they would go in their bed. I mean, it's a little funny. And they would just close their eyes and go to bed, right? And it was just kind of interesting to work through this with each of the kids. And we kind of did it.
We had 2 separate conversations. Yeah. We talked to each of them separately.
Yeah, which was super interesting, right? Because they both had like really different perspectives on the whole thing.
And I remember, I think it was your older son where you were like, and I had to be like, you have to believe what he's saying.
I know, yeah.
For him.
I wasn't sure if he was really telling me the truth.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you did teach me that because he left and I said, I think he's totally lying, like whatever, that wasn't even true. And you're like, well, it's what he decided to make the truth. And you know what, since he's going to go there and that's where he's at, we're just going to go there and we're going to see if that ends up working for him. And I mean, at the end of the day, we did have to kind of come back and revise because I think it was a little inauthentic, but it was interesting. And also I realized also in listening to them, just that my expectation could be changed slightly too. Like just, understanding that they do need a little bit of time to chat and bond and that, there's perhaps a little bit of change in that way that I could also offer. They don't have to be programmed.
Yeah. Well, that's good, right? Because especially with bedtime, I mean, I have a 2-year-old and I am the most regimented bedtime person ever. First of all, like by the time 7 p.m. rolls around, I'm like exhausted. I'm like, go to sleep, goodbye,
Right.
But also like, I know that she needs to get into bed at 7. Otherwise it's just like, it's just a disaster.
Yeah.
And
the regulation, like sleep is so key. And I know I get that way too. But for children, if they're getting dysregulated during the day, that was something I was so worried about, is not giving them that sleep. And then not having, when we were in COVID, we weren't leaving the house and I was worried we weren't getting enough activity. It was like a lot of those kinds of things. And So.
But it's interesting. You said actually 2 interesting things. The first is that you had to revisit your solution, which I think is really important clear, because like it's okay if you have to revisit a solution. That doesn't mean you failed. That doesn't mean your kid failed, right? Like none of this is a failure. Actually, what Dr. Green says is that even if you don't get to a solution and you just talk, that's a successful plan B, right? Like just getting your kid to talk to you about anything. And so sometimes what does happen, and I found this a lot when I worked in kids in school, is that the kid tells you something because they're nervous. Because remember, kids haven't been listened to like this before. So they tell you something, and then, but each time, if you have to reevaluate a solution, each time you kind of get more and more closer to what's really, really going on. You will, of course, have some kids that just are so happy. They're like, blah, 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 and they'll tell you everything, but that's often not the case.
Right.
So, you know, it's okay to revisit a solution.
Absolutely.
So has anyone shared any expectations, or no? No one's feeling, is anyone feeling brave?
No.
That's okay. That's okay. I just hope people are doing it. Yeah. Like I didn't think anyone really would, but I do hope people are actually doing this exercise for themselves, because remember, this is all an effort in shifting your mindset and seeing these challenging situations in a different light. So I do hope you are taking these few minutes to kind of work through this for yourself. Yeah. So your clash occurs when the person that doesn't have the skills to handle the expectations being placed on them. So imagine giving the book War and Peace to a child who hasn't learned to read yet, and you expect them to read and explain what it's about, right? Like that's ridiculous. We would never do that. So why, if there's the other expectations that we have, like why are we expecting our kids to follow those certain expectations if they're just too unrealistic for them? So on the flip side, clashes don't occur when the person does have the skills to meet those expectations, or when the expectations don't exceed their own skills. So that's my favorite image. This is always in my brain. When I'm coaching parents, I'm always thinking, talk to me, and I'll say it. I'll say, wait, talk to me more about that expectation, right? Like, and I coach you through thinking through that expectation. And I find that actually when we sit and talk about expectations, that's where the biggest mind shift really starts, is parents realizing like, wow, maybe these demands are just too high, and I have to modify them. And that's okay. That's really okay. I promise. You still can hold the bar high and keep expectations realistic. Okay. The assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. So this is now we're getting into the details of the model and less about the background. And this is really how Mary and anyone else that I work with use to learn the model as another parenting tool. So the assessment of lagging skills, this is your proactive tool for how you will decide on the unsolved problems and the lagging skills that your child has. So if you can see over, I'm pointing at my screen as if people can actually see what I'm pointing at. I forget that I'm not live and in person. I'm such a hand talker that it's hard for me.
Totally.
So the left side, it says lagging skills. There's a list of skills that, those are the potential lagging skills that your kid might have. Your kid might have an unsolved problem in every single lagging skill. Your kid might not have an unsolved problem in every single lagging skill. That's okay. It's not, and the right side is where you're going to write down the unsolved problems. So the OWSOP is meant to be a discussion guide. This is really important. I think people get tripped up on this, and it's meant to be a discussion guide, not a checklist. So we start at the top, and we don't cherry pick the lagging skills, because we really want to get out all the unsolved problems for each lagging skill before moving on to the next. If at any point, any caregiver thinks that there is an unsolved problem for a lagging skill, that's fine, and we write it down. So basically what happens, and you can see on the right side of our screen, I have blown up some of the lagging skills just so you can have an opportunity to look through them and see them a little bit more and closer. So let's say you're starting at the top, you're starting with difficulty handling transitions, shifting from one mindset task or another, or task to another. I actually find this is a really, really common one that most people do check off. So you say, yes, oh my, that's my kid's issue. Then you check it off, and then you move over to the right side and you write down, now this is the important part, you write down every unsolved problem that you can possibly think of. So even if you think of something that actually has to do more with maintaining focus, it doesn't matter, just write it down. If you, right, like this is a discussion guide, so you think of one thing and it makes you think of another, and we write it all down. Then so once we've written down every unsolved problem we could possibly think of, then we go back and check off the lagging skills that those unsolved problems fall into. So we're not doing this as a one-for-one. We're just using this to discuss all the unsolved problems that are coming up for our child. The unsolved problem, another way to think about it, is an unmet expectation. So just some interesting tidbit, the most overlooked lagging skill are the language processing and the communication skills. Those are the most overlooked. So think about your kid, right? This means knowing the signal that your child is sending to you, is that they're having difficulty. And it's so important because they can't express, they're having difficulty expressing that. So if you think about, especially our kids, or students that have any type of language-based learning disability, how hard it would be to communicate that challenge to you. The second most overlooked lagging skill is the black and white, concrete or literal thinking. A lot of kids fall into that, and I think parents and caregivers are struggle with that a little bit. So the wording.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
I have a question here. Maybe this would be something you could use as an example. So a participant here says, what do I do when the kid doesn't listen or I have to remind him every time? I'm sure you need context and everything, but just generally speaking, if that's something that you're thinking of, like, how would you sort of work it through?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on what they're not listening about, but let's choose the handling transition. So let's say, difficulty getting dressed to go to school, right? So that actually is a transition. And, if you have to remind them again and again and again, right? Like that's a pervasive unsolved problem. It's happening. It's not just a one-off. So you know that this is something you proactively want to solve. So the goal really of the model is that you don't have to remind them again and again, and that you don't have to nag them to get dressed for school, because you're going to put some type of solution in place that's going to allow, because they've been a part of this conversation, they've collaboratively come up with the solution with you, and they take ownership over it. So the goal is that you're not being that nagging parent or caregiver to your child. So, the point of the ALSUP is to look at these lagging skills and use them to predict those challenging behaviors. And again, I'm assuming based on this question, the kid is not screaming and kicking and punching when they're being reminded, and they're just sort of ignoring you. And that's actually, ignoring is kind of a lucky behavior, right? So, the kid is just sort of a little bit lucky that you're just generally annoyed, but you're not kind of like scared or at your wit's end type of thing. I hope that answered that question.
And then from there, just so that just to paint the picture of the whole thing, like once you kind of identify these skills, then you would work through those 3 steps that we outlined before, right? Which is you'd sit down with your kid away from that situation that you're not listening, that they're not listening. You do it at a time that's away from that. And you say to them, I'm noticing that you're having difficulty getting dressed in the morning. What's up? And then you would go through the steps like that Becky would kind of like work you through, and, to help you get at what the child's perspective is. And then you share your concerns and then you come up with a solution. It's like a 3-step process, basically.
Yes. And because maybe what's coming up for your kid is it could be something completely different than what you think is coming up. You probably think they're just avoiding going to school, I would imagine, if that's what the unsolved problem is. But, giving the kid the voice allows you to be a little surprised about what's coming up for your kid.
Yep.
Okay, I want to keep moving because I want to make sure we get through. So and maybe Mary, we could just spend like 1 minute on this slide.
Sure.
I wanted everyone to take a minute and write down a few unsolved problems. And here's some key things that you need in an unsolved problem. You're free of challenging behaviors. So you're not putting in difficulty not eating junk food at night, right? So it might be like difficulty eating dessert that was served at dinner, right? So you're leaving out the behavior, you're making it really objective, right? Like this is the dessert and it's difficult for you to eat it. You're free of your adult theories, right? So you're not saying, I'm just giving the examples from here. You're not saying difficulty eating dinner at the same time as the family because he doesn't like what mom made for dinner, right? So you're leaving out your adult theory. You're splitting it up. So you're not saying difficulty putting their food in the refrigerator. You're saying like difficulty cleaning up after you make lunch, right? So you are saying putting food back in the refrigerator. You're not saying cleaning up, because cleaning up is really, really general. It's really about putting the food away. And then you're being as specific as possible. You're thinking of the who, the what, the when, and the where, and not the why. So you're really asking yourself, and this is something I do a lot in my coaching, is I coach you to ask yourself, what expectation is the child having difficulty meeting? And that's how you always want to think to yourself when you're writing unsolved problems, is what is the expectation? And you want to be as upstream, as far away from the challenging behavior as possible. So you really have to go backwards and think, like, what is the real expectation here? Can you share one or two of your unsolved problems? And we've shared a bunch of them already, I feel like.
Sure. Well, we could go into one of the participants' ones too.
It's that'd be great. Yeah. Yay, someone shared.
Yeah. So I have to remind him to make notes on remote days, or remind him to revise his work on what the teacher said right on that time.
Those are some of my favorite ones. Okay, so your revising notes would be taking notes would be difficulty taking notes
on remote days,
on remote school days. Or if you want to, I actually would be more specific than that, because like what's difficult about taking notes in science could be different than social studies, could be different in English, right? So I actually would split all those up, and it makes your list feel really long. But there is a strategy in the Plan B discussion where you can ask, like, is this the same concern with math and science notes, right? So I would say, let's say it's social studies, difficulty taking social studies notes on remote days. Mm-hmm. So you're really, really specific. So the expectation is that your child takes notes during his or her social studies class on the days that they're in remote learning. And if the other one is actually, this person said it pretty nicely, difficulty going back to revise your math homework or your English homework or whatever it is.
Like in the moment though, like, so if the teacher, I assume this is what this means. And Frida, you could revise your comment if I'm getting this wrong. But I think what you're saying is that the expectation is that as the student's hearing the new information from the teacher, that the student is revising the answer based on what the teacher is saying. So now the learning is recorded in the notebook so that later on they have evidence of that learning, right? So that's the expectation.
If that's the case, then actually it's really about taking notes, right, on the teacher's presentation. Mm-hmm, yeah. To me, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but the revising is like the teacher checked their work and was like, oh, there's a mistake. Mm-hmm. Go back and fix it. And the kid's like, no, which I've run into a bajillion times. I mean, kids hate to revise their work. I mean,
right.
And they're when they're done, they're just done. So there's two different ways, right, depending on what the situation is. It could be taking notes on your teacher's presentation in math class, and it could be going back to revising your double-digit multiplication problems in math class or something like that.
What do you say to parents who encounter like resistance or like, a lack of motivation to meet the expectations that we would assume are like, work ethic, or just kind of like, like if a child, for example, decides, like you just mentioned, like, I don't want to do that. Like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to go back and revise that. How do you handle that within the model when you have like those kinds of actions?
I would argue that, and actually I'm going to flip to the next slide because I think some of this gets at that.
Okay.
So number 5 and 6, these are the 6 key themes of the model. When we do coaching, I do a really deep dive into the 6 key themes.
Yep.
But look at themes 5 and 6. Kids do well if they can, and doing well is preferable. Everybody wants to do well, right? Like, it is really, really rare for a kid to actually think to themselves, I'd rather get in trouble. There definitely are kids out there that get the thrill and all that, but I would say 9 out of 10 kids and human beings want to do well. And if they could actually do well, they would, right? No one enjoys getting into trouble, even as an adult. Think about all the times if your boss sends you emails, hey, can we chat, right? You're freaking out. Oh my God, what did I do? I sent that email. And half the time it's nothing with bosses, but right, the kids would do well if they can. So I actually would argue that thinking it's a lack of motivation, or they don't care, or they just don't want to, is actually your adult theory. And you don't actually know what's going on for them in that moment. There could be a lagging skill that's really getting in their way. And the way that their signal is saying, I don't care, doesn't matter. Why do I have to learn this, right? I mean, I think I would guess a lot of parents on this talk, their kids have said things like, I don't even care about social studies. Why do I need to know this, right? And whether you think they need to know it or not, it's really, maybe they're having difficulty reading the textbook. Maybe they're having difficulty understanding the questions that the teacher is asking of them. Maybe they're really, really nervous about the test coming up and they have no idea how to study for it, right? Like, there are so many things. So I always lead with the belief that it's not a lack of motivation. It's not the kid just doesn't care, is that there's something getting in their way of meeting that expectation.
That's huge. That's so huge. I think that's really interesting because I feel like when you have kids, going back to that like unlucky behavior stuff, I've definitely encountered in my career many children who've given me that like unlucky response, which is really hard for me to then regulate myself because it sort of turns me off. Like if I have a kid that gets on and they're like, I do not want to do this, or like, the attitude, or just sometimes that they're just being fresh, or they're whatever it is, there's some kind of like screaming or resistance, and it feels so awful to be on the receiving end of those things, and I think that like those moments of receiving that kind of information, it takes a lot to go into this. Kids do well if they can. Like, I feel like, you know what I'm saying? It's like very hard to reframe your mindset.
It's so hard. By the way,
yes,
this is actually my mantra for every human in my life, right? Like my husband would do well if he could.
Right.
My sister would do well if she could, right? Like, if this is actually a motto that you can adopt, not just for your kids.
True.
Right?
True. In the climate we're in, right? Yeah, true.
Especially in the climate we're in, but just even in just normal, whenever normal life resumes, God willing, it's soon, this is a really, really good mantra to repeat to yourself, and it's short and it's simple and it's something to remember. It's key. It's really key. And honestly, in my years of doing CPS and being certified and giving talks like this, usually the key themes 5 and 6 are kind of like the light bulb for adults, teachers, caregivers, whoever, that they're like, wow, yeah, of course doing well is preferable, Yeah. And the people that really adopt that mindset have the most success with CPS.
Accurate. It's just harder. I would say it's harder, like when I have, like my youngest is a little older, so we used to have a lot more like meltdowns. The meltdowns, I think, are really hard to handle.
Oh, and I'm in the thick of it. My daughter's 2.
Yeah, you're in it. It's really hard to handle because, it's so dysregulating at the time, and you really can't employ any of this in the moment, right? You just have to like kind of grin and bear it and just move forward and try to just not be so reactive. And that's really hard to do. Similarly, when your kid is just at that frustration level of, I don't want to do this, like go away kind of thing, or just that you're telling them for the 100th time to write something down and you've told them 100 times. Like when you're in the moment, the thing I've learned is just that this is not the time to do any of this stuff, which is so helpful. But for me, as somebody who loves like solving problems, and I love instant gratification of solving problems, really, that was hard. That was a hard space for me to be in, and just knowing that like I really can't do much right now. We just have to like roll with this uncomfortable yuck for a little bit. Yeah.
It is. Listen, I've been doing CPS for years now, so I'm really comfortable with it, but it is a practice in being uncomfortable for sure. Yeah. It's a totally different way than we were parented, that we were taught in school, right? Like it is completely different. And I recognize that. And I too, when I first learned this, I was a teacher in school and I was really uncomfortable doing it.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And I think that's also right. Like use the kids do well if you can model for yourself. I would do well if I could, right? So it's okay if you slide back into plan A every once in a while. It's okay if your plan B doesn't go exactly the way you thought it would, right? All this is okay. It's really about how you put your foot forward and how you approach these situations. And like you said, nothing productive is, and I'm sure everyone on this talk can appreciate this sentiment, that nothing productive is going to happen in the moment.
Yeah.
How many times have you been fighting with your spouse and you're just screaming at each other and you're just like throwing insults at each other and nothing productive is happening?
Yeah. It's just,
you're never solving whatever issue you were fighting about.
Right.
Because you're too hot. So taking it out of the moment is really what's going to be, it's really a huge, huge, huge piece of collaborative and proactive solutions.
That was huge for me. I mean, I did sort of know that before, but I don't know that I knew what to do out of the moment as much as I know now, which has really, actually what's very interesting is it's really helped to minimize those moments in my own home to many degrees, and when it's happening, I noticed that, my husband and I are kind of going, we got to talk about that with him later. It's like sort of now we're there, which is really different than we were where we were 6 months ago. So it's an interesting process if you really just jump in and learn the intense and like we had to really work with you for many sessions to really like sit down and my husband had notes. He was like, okay, I got this notebook, and I'm just like, he's just writing literally everything down.
No, he was so good.
I mean, because it was a totally new way of thinking about things, but we still wanted to do it because it just makes such good sense in terms of so many things that we wanted, for our family. We just needed to be in this better place in general. So it's really not for us.
And by the way, if anyone has little ones, I mean, my daughter's 2, and I don't, whoever was listening when we first came on before 8 p.m., I was talking about literally tonight, my 2-year-old, like, tried to hit the book from my hand, and her dinner plate went flying and everything. And my husband happened to come in at that moment, and she actually was like, I was really frustrated. And I threw my dinner plate. And it was like a moment where she knew she would be supported when she expressed, obviously I'm such a nerd that I this is my whole life, right? Like I am such a CPS nerd that I really fully live this, but look at what it's doing for my daughter, and what an amazing gift to give her that she can talk to us about what she's feeling and what's going on for her, and know that we will support her and we will work with her to find a solution that's going to fit for everybody. I mean, to me, that's the biggest gift.
It's the goal. Yeah.
It's really the goal. It really is. There are 3 plans. Plan B, Plan C, and Plan A. Plan A is what we don't use. That's, if you think back to Jamie in the beginning, that's our unilateral and uninformed plan. That's probably what most of us are doing now. Plan B is that collaborative, informed conversation. And Plan C is really used in conjunction with Plan B. I'm not going to go really into detail with it because it's really confusing for people. I think this is where people actually get the most tripped up, but it is putting aside expectations and unsolved problems that you just don't need to solve right now so they don't cause those incompatibility episodes. So I'm going to glaze over this because I actually want to talk about the 3 steps because I think this is important. So there are 3 steps to plan B. And then if any questions come in, please stop me. There are 3 steps. The first step is the empathy step. So this is where you're posing your unsolved problem and you're gathering information from the child about their concerns, their perspective, their point of view. They're really specific, and we've touched on them a little bit. There are a really specific drilling strategies, and we like to say drilling, not grilling. Drilling strategies that you're going to use to gather information from your kid. So even like when Mary said that her son, it was just dead silence. There's even a drilling strategy for that. So the drilling strategies are going to be key to driving the conversation. And this is where the adult is just listening. You are not giving any 2 cents. You are not putting your adult concern. The bulk of the Plan B conversation is in the empathy step. The define adult concern at invitation step actually is quite quick usually. The empathy step is where you're going to get the good stuff.
Just to give you some language tips, this is my notes. So you can say things like, how so? I don't quite understand. I'm confused. Can you say more about that? What do you mean? Wait, who is making fun of your clothes? What's getting in the way of you completing that science project, right? Yeah. Where is Eddie bossing you around? You seem to be doing really well in your group work in math, but not so well in your group work in social studies. What's getting in the way in social studies? So there's literally like language you can just practice and use. And then what's great when Becky was working with us is that she made us use like language in each of the different spots. So we kind of got that rehearsal, like, I think you should go to that one. I think you should go to that one, which again, you don't really realize like how many lagging skills I had in this area, but it was really helpful to have that specific coaching and the language piece. For me, this is like, I go back to this often and really look at it. I know many of us are at time, and if you do have to go, I just want to remind you, we're going to continue talking for a few more minutes, but we will place this on our YouTube channel so you can finish watching it if you need to leave. Please stay if you can. And if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. We will make sure we address them. We do not mind. If you have scenarios you just want to like think about, feel free. And I'll let Becky continue. Yeah.
Yeah. I do hope that people that have to leave got something good out of this. Yeah. And I'm happy to answer any questions. People can reach out at any point. So the empathy step is really the bulk of it. And we have these really specific strategies that we're going to use. After you feel like you've gotten all the information that you possibly could get from your kid, you're going to move into the define adult concern step. And this is where your adult concern gets brought into consideration. And your concerns have to fall into one or both of these 2 categories. It has to show how it is affecting the child, or how it's affecting others. So if we think back to our dinner example, how it's affecting the child is Jamie was missing out on family community and family time. And how it's affecting everyone else, everyone has to wait to eat dinner for Jamie to come, right? So and there are certain ways to say that, and we talk through all of that. After your concern has been brought onto the table, then we have the invitation step, which is where we have the solution. And we talked through this a little bit, where we have to, we recap both parties' concerns, and then we give the child the first stab at coming up with a solution. And then we evaluate every single solution on the 2 criteria that it has to be realistic and it has to be mutually satisfactory. And that's it. No, that's the plan B, but it's amazing what you can learn from your kid if you sit and listen. And I think what's different is that I think most people say, well, I sit and listen to my kid, which I believe that you do. But I think what's different is that this really removes all judgment. And
totally guilty of that. Like, so appreciate that's remember when you were first working, and I was like, my mind is literally blown. Like, I've always thought I've listened to my kids. Like, that's like a big parenting, like, must for me. And then I was just shocked as to how much judgment I was placing into the situation. I couldn't believe it.
I mean, it's human nature. Everyone places judgment.
I know. I was just shocked, though. I was really, really shocked about that.
I also think that people say, like, well, I'm the adult. I know what's going on here.
Yeah.
But I don't, you know, when you think about feelings that your kid has, only they know what feelings they're having.
Sure.
Right? So who's the best source of information? It's your kid.
Right.
So any questions coming up?
Nope. But I did put in the chat just, you know, where everyone can reach Becky at evolveded.com. She is offering coaching sessions with families now. So if you're interested in doing that, you may do that. You can also receive the recording of this video on my YouTube channel, and we'll also send everybody a link to that tomorrow. And just feel free to post your questions, because we'll stick around for a little bit, and we're happy to chat through a scenario or two if you have one that you'd like us to play around with. But hopefully you did find today really interesting. I know there's a lot of interest in this right now, especially as we're all really, really in it with our kids. I think it's becoming, like, for us, when we were doing this, it was during COVID, and we were so apparent of their lagging skills. It became really clear. So I'm really glad to bring this to everyone's attention, and we'll do more of this as we go along. So please stay tuned. So we do have a question. Yay.
Oh, great.
I love scenarios that we can help. Okay. So how do you best handle punishment for catching your teen vaping because he wanted to try it?
Interesting. So remember, CPS is non-punitive, right? Because punishment is a plan A, and you're not actually solving any problems. So I would go as upstream and as far away from the behavior as possible, and think to yourself, what is my expectation? Right? So maybe it is, this is a really tricky one. I love these. Maybe your expectation is that your child talks to you or asks questions about drugs and alcohol, right? So you might say, notice you're having difficulty talking about being curious about drugs and alcohol. Or I noticed you're having difficulty, I'm trying to think what other ways we could phrase this, but I would really just go at it with curiosity, and listen, I understand you want to punish because you think that's how they're going to learn to not vape anymore, and you want them to understand the dangers, right? And they can, when you talk about your adult concern, right? Because that falls into the category of how it's affecting the kid. But going at them with curiosity and saying, hey, what was difficult for you about talking to me about your curiosity about vaping? I want to hear more from you. I want to be somebody that you can speak to, right? And think about those parenting goals that you have, and coming at them with that, and thinking of a solution surrounding if they want to try it again next time, or if they want to try shot of tequila or whatever, that they come to you first and say, this is something I'm really thinking about. Like, what are your thoughts? Can we research this a little bit more, right? So that way they know that they have a safe space to talk to you without the judgment, without the punishment. That's how I would.
I think going back to the expectations is key, and just understanding, like, is your expectation that he not try it? If that's the expectation, then you have to kind of think of, well, right, that would be like, if that was the expectation, I don't want my kid to try vaping, then where would you go from there?
I mean, as horrible as this is, I would argue, is that actually a realistic expectation? We can evaluate that for each individual family, but kids are going to try those things. So what do you really, really want? What you want is them to come to you and talk about that, right? Kids are going to try it because that's what kids do. We all did that as kids. Our kids are all going to do that. And there's a part of us that has to realize that expecting our kids not to might not be the most realistic expectation, but talking about ways to say no or tell their friend they're really uncomfortable or come to you about questions they might have is the better, in my opinion, the better way to approach that situation. And you know, I still remember this, that my parents always said to me when I was in high school, I know you're going to drink. You're 17. That's what 17-year-olds do. I hope you will always call us to pick you up. Never get in a car. We will never be mad at you. And guess what? I did call them to pick me up and they were never mad at me. And then the next day we did have a conversation and they said, we just want you to talk to us about these things. What are you so curious about? Would you like to try this drink at dinner so we can be there to support you through it, right? So I think opening the lines of communication that way is you're going to have way less sneaking around surrounding drugs and alcohol, which is obviously a huge deal, than if you just spoke to them about it, if you didn't speak to them about it and you punish them, because if you punish them, then they're going to keep sneaking around. And then what if it's something worse? Or what if they take too big of a hit and something, right? Like there's so many things that could go wrong. So I think especially surrounding tricky topics like that, you really want those lines of communication open. And maybe, I mean, Dr. Green would be mad at me for saying this, but maybe it's not like the exact prescriptive CPS conversation here, but you're using the framework to frame a conversation like that.
And what about like the notion of, like, what if my expectation is I want my kid to realize the information about vaping and the harm that it will do to their bodies and make like, I mean, again, this is where I guess I get into a little challenge because like I worry about kids in general, like making choices for their bodies that would hurt them, and because you know they aren't thinking about that maybe. And then I go back to like, okay, let's say the car seat issue. You know, when your kid was in the car seat and they were screaming and you're like, too bad you have to sit in the car seat.
Yeah. Right, you would never not
So like, is this a car seat situation? I guess that's kind of where I get a little bit into I'm not sure, like, you know, is there ever a time in which you're just kind of plan A-ing it, where you're like, okay, guess what, guys, like line is drawn in the sand here. We're not like, I don't know. So I guess I'm just wondering what you think.
I totally hear you. I think it's about the mindset and the way you approach it. If you approach it with that plan A, you are going to get a kid who will sneak around. You just will. If you approach it with, I know this is going to come up for you. Let's talk about this. Can we, my idea is to right? So I said, like, maybe this isn't the exact plan B conversation based on the script, but maybe you're using this framework to say, like, one idea I had is to research the effects of vaping on your body together. What do you think of that? Let's evaluate that. Is that realistic and mutually satisfactory for you? Oh, you want to research it on your own first, and then we'll schedule a family meeting to talk about it. You don't want to research it with me sitting there. Cool. I'm cool with that. Right. So I think it's about making sure that you're making it a safe space for them, right? Because the more that you push them, the more they're going to push back. I mean, that's the nature of a teenager, or kid in general.
That makes sense. I think I'll call you when that time comes for me.
Yeah, please. We can have that conversation together.
Yeah.
Also, remind me of this when my daughter is 17.
Sure. It's hard. That's a hard